There is a moment in Gravity Falls where the camera stops being a camera and becomes something closer to an eye pressed against the inside of someone's skull. Dipper Pine steps through a door that should not exist, into the mind of his own great uncle, and the walls do not hold still. Furniture drifts, corridors fold back on themselves like something breathing, doors open onto memories instead of rooms, and the whole space hums with the sense that it was built by someone who never expected to be walked in on. It lasts only a little while, and then the episode moves on because Gravity Falls always moves on, cheerful and busy and full of jokes as if nothing strange had happened at all. And that is the thing almost nobody talks about with this show. Gravity Falls got away with slipping the floor out from under its own reality dozens of times before it ever got to the part everybody remembers. The part with the sky tearing open and the town turning into a carnival of nightmares. Long before Weirdmageddon, this was already a series that kept rewriting what its own world was allowed to do, quietly, without asking permission. A memory could be pulled out of someone's head like a tooth and put on a shelf. A ghost could condition a family's bloodline like a dog trained not to bark. A boy's own face could stop being his for an evening. These things happened in broad daylight, dressed up as a kid's cartoon, and Gravity Falls almost never made a fuss about any of it. It just let the strangeness sit there and trusted you to notice. Or not notice, and either way it kept going. Tonight we are going through all of it, not ranking it, not arguing about which episode is the weirdest, just walking through the show's relationship with unreality in the order it actually happens, watching it grow from small, contained detours into someone's mind, all the way up to the moment the entire town stops being able to trust its own geography. If you are here to fall asleep, this suits the format well because Gravity Falls itself works a little like a long dream, one strange room leading into the next, and we are simply going to walk through those rooms slowly together with the lights down. So get comfortable. We will be here a while, and if you have not subscribed to Pine Hat yet, it really does help us keep making these. Before we go anywhere near the mindscape or the memory gun or the sock puppet with a demon behind its eye, it helps to plant a few flat, dependable facts in the ground, because everything else tonight gets built on top of them. Gravity Falls was created by Alex Hirsch. It ran across Disney Channel and then Disney XD, starting in June of 2012 and finishing in February of 2016. 2 seasons, 40 episodes, plus a handful of shorts scattered around them. That is the whole run, not 3 seasons, not some quietly canceled 4th year sitting in a drawer somewhere. 2 summers, on screen, and then it stopped on its own terms, by its creator's choice, at a point where the story actually had somewhere to land. That matters more than it sounds like it should, because a lot of what makes this show feel so strange in hindsight is that it never had the luxury of stalling. Every hallucination, every dream sequence, every unexplained flicker of wrongness had to eventually connect to something, because there was a finish line the whole time, even if the audience did not know exactly where it was. What we are calling Trippy tonight is not just weirdness for its own sake. Cartoons do weirdness all the time. A talking dog, a character who steps outside the frame for a joke, a background gag with too many eyes. That is not really what we mean. What Gravity Falls does again and again, starting small and then less and less small, is let the actual logic of its world bend. Not a joke about reality breaking, but reality breaking, treated with something close to seriousness, even inside an episode that is also doing pratfalls and puns in the same 11 minutes. Dream logic bleeds into daylight logic here. A show about 2 kids spending a summer with their great uncle in a small town in Oregon keeps finding new, specific, mechanical ways to ask what happens when the inside of somebody's head stops staying inside their head. The spine of tonight follows that idea forward in time because it does actually move forward, step by step, and each stop earns the next one. We start in the mindscape itself, the literal architecture of someone's memory rendered as a place you can walk through because that is where the show first shows its hand, and it does so early in the first season, long before anyone watching had any reason to think this was going to be a story about buried secrets and a demon with a taste for deals. From there, we go to a town that has organized itself around forgetting, a secret society with a very specific piece of machinery built for pulling memories out of people's skulls and storing them like specimens, a much colder and more bureaucratic kind of unreality than a dream, and arguably more unsettling for it. Then to a mansion with a ghost in it, where the trippiness stops being about hallucination altogether and becomes about conditioning. about a family that has spent generations training its own child the way you might train an animal, which is Gravity Falls, finding a way to make psychology itself feel supernatural. Then to an evening with a sock puppet and a talent show for a boy Mabel likes, an episode that starts as pure comedy and ends with a body on screen that everyone in the room knows no longer belongs to the person wearing it. Then to the episode where Stan Pines, the series' gruff, lovable con man at the center of everything, turns out to have been performing an entire identity for the whole run of the series, which is trippy in a way that has nothing to do with special effects at all, just the sick feeling of realizing the ground you have been standing on the whole time was never really there. And then, finally, to the moment, all of that gets scaled up past the size of one mind, one town, one family, into the sky itself coming apart over Gravity Falls, and a demon nobody could touch finally getting hands. It is worth being honest about something up front because this channel tries to keep a clean line between what actually happened on screen and what people have theorized about it afterward. And Gravity Falls is exactly the kind of show that invites people to blur that line because it wants you looking for the seams. So the plan tonight is to stay careful about that distinction. When something happened in the show, we will say it happened and usually which season and episode it happened in, because that is checkable and there is no reason to be vague about it. When we are reading into what something means, we will say that plainly too, because interpretation is really the whole reason to spend an evening with a show like this instead of just summarizing it. And on the rare occasion we bring in something from outside the actual broadcast episodes, a companion book, a writer's room detail that only exists secondhand, we will flag it clearly as exactly that, because there is a difference between what Gravity Falls showed its audience across those 2 seasons and what has been added to the story since it ended. And this really is a series that keeps getting added to even now, years after it finished. That alone tells you something about how it was built. A cartoon that ran for 2 seasons on a channel mostly known for laugh tracks and slapstick does not usually end up with people still combing through its frames for hidden ciphers a decade later, still arguing about what a demon's death actually meant, still writing companion books to answer questions the series left open on purpose. Gravity Falls earned that kind of afterlife by being unusually patient with its own weirdness. It let a 12-year-old girl's puppet show and her twin brother's mind getting invaded by a triangle exist in the same tonal register, sweet and funny and then suddenly cold, without ever explaining itself, without ever stopping to reassure you that everything was fine. It trusted that kids could sit with a little unease, the way you sit with an odd dream after you wake up from it and cannot quite place why it is still bothering you an hour later. That is really the feeling we are chasing tonight more than any specific episode. The feeling of watching something ordinary, a family dinner, a summer job at a tourist trap gift shop, a school talent show, and realizing partway through that the rules underneath it have quietly changed and nobody on screen is going to stop and point that out to you. Gravity Falls does that over and over, and the version everybody remembers, the one with the apocalypse and the tarot cards, and the demon triangle laughing over a burning town, is really just the loudest version of something the series had been doing in a whisper since its first season. We are going to trace that whisper all the way up to the shout tonight slowly, in order, starting with the very first time this show let a camera walk into somebody's mind and treated it like nothing unusual at all. Before we get there, it helps to say a little more about what a mind actually looks like once Gravity Falls decides to show you one, because there are rules here, even if the series never states them out loud, and those rules are going to matter for basically every stop we make tonight. There is a difference between a dream, a memory, a hallucination, and whatever it is that lives underneath Stan Pine's gruff exterior, and Gravity Falls is oddly careful about keeping those categories distinct, even while it lets them bleed into each other visually. That carefulness is part of why none of this ever feels like empty randomness, the kind of surrealism a lesser show might reach for just because it looks cool in a thumbnail. Every strange image in this world is eventually paying rent. The melting architecture, the objects that shouldn't be there, the doors that open onto the wrong rooms, all of it is doing quiet structural work long before the story tells you what that work was for. So that's where we're headed tonight. Into the mindscape first, and then out from there, room by room, into a summer that slowly stops behaving like a summer at all. Bill Cipher does not begin the series as a villain in any conventional sense, and it helps to be precise about what he actually is before we watch him do anything at all. According to the journals, and later through the character's own accounting of himself, he is a 2-dimensional being, a demon native to a dimension called Euclidia, a place that no longer exists by the time we meet him. That detail matters more than it sounds like it should. He is not a ghost of the town, not a local spirit tied to Gravity Falls the way the ghost haunting the Northwest Mansion will turn out to be, tied to one family's specific cruelty. Bill is an import. He comes from somewhere else entirely, somewhere flat, somewhere that no longer exists to be gone back to. And the place he operates in while he waits for a way into our world is not his home at all. It is the mindscape, the shared psychic space behind human sleep and memory, a kind of commons that he has learned to walk through the way the rest of us walk through a hallway. He is a tenant there, not an owner, and that distinction between Euclidia, his ruined home, and the mindscape, the space he squats in, is going to be worth holding on to because it explains something important about how strange this series is allowed to get at any given point in its run. Here is the rule, and it is a real one, honored with more discipline than you would expect from a Saturday morning cartoon. Bill cannot simply walk into the physical world. He needs a door. Someone has to open it for him. Whether that is a handshake deal struck in a dream, a summoning performed with candles and a circle of the mildly unwise, or, eventually, a machine built for an entirely different purpose that happens to tear a hole exactly where he has been waiting. Until one of those doors opens, he is confined to minds. He can visit you while you sleep. He can needle his way into a moment of desperation and offer you something you want, in exchange for something you should not give away. But he cannot simply appear on Main Street and start causing trouble. Not in the early seasons, not before the specific door gets open that the whole series has been building toward. This is why his first appearances feel the way they feel, contained, almost polite, a menace you can wake up from. It is also why, when the door finally does open later in the story, the change in his behavior reads as a genuine escalation rather than a plot inconsistency. Gravity Falls is not cheating here. It is following its own physics. A two-dimensional demon from a dead dimension, borrowing a shared mental commons, waiting for an invitation, is a specific and consistent kind of monster, and it behaves specifically and consistently for most of the run. Which brings us to the first time the series actually takes us inside somebody's head and shows us what that commons looks like from within. An episode from the first season called Dreamscaperers, which aired in July of 2013. By this point in the story, Stan has been caught doing something shady, the kind of low-grade blackmail scheme he tends to run when nobody is watching closely. And the specific problem facing Dipper and the others is photographic evidence, incriminating pictures that exist somewhere they cannot simply grab with their hands. Dipper's solution is to go get them anyway, not by breaking into a drawer or a safe, but by entering Stan's mind directly and finding the memory itself, the way you might go looking for a misplaced object in a house you know reasonably well. What the series does with that premise is where the episode earns its place at the start of tonight's list. A mind, in Gravity Falls' visual logic, is a house. Not a metaphorical house that the narration describes for you, but an actual architecture the camera walks you through room after room, each one holding a specific memory, the way a room in a real house might hold a specific piece of furniture. Corridors extend further than any physical building would allow. Doors open onto scenes that do not connect logically to what is behind the last door. Furniture drifts very slightly, unmoored from ordinary gravity, the way objects behave in the loose, unpoliced physics of an actual dream rather than the exaggerated physics of ordinary cartoon slapstick. It is a subtle difference, and it is the correct one. The animators are not drawing something wacky here. They are drawing something that feels the way the inside of your own head sometimes feels at 3 a.m, half familiar, half wrong, entirely convinced of its own logic while you are inside it. And it is inside this architecture that Bill Cipher gets to be frightening for the first time, in a register the series has not used on him before and will not need to use again in quite the same way because after this episode he is simply known. Up until Dreamscaperers, he has mostly been a suggestion, a shape glimpsed in the margins, a triangle drawn into the corner of a page, or flickering at the edge of somebody's dream. Here he gets a full stage, the run of Stan's own mind, and the story lets him use it the way a landlord who has finally been left alone in a tenant's house might use it, rearranging things, threatening things, treating the whole space as leverage. He is playful about it in the specific way that makes him worse rather than better. Cheerful commentary layered over real menace, jokes that do not relax the tension so much as they confirm he is enjoying himself while the children in the scene are not. Dipper and the others are not just looking for a memory anymore by the time this episode turns. They are trying to get out of a house that has decided, on some level, that it does not want to let them leave, with something at the helm of that house that finds their panic mildly funny. There is something worth sitting with in the choice to stage all of this so early, a full season before the mythology around Bill becomes load-bearing to the rest of the plot. A lot of shows aimed at children would hold a sequence like this in reserve, would treat this journey into someone's actual mind as a season finale trick, something to spend once, spectacularly near the end. Gravity Falls spends it in the middle of its first season, almost a full year before the plot machinery that will make it matter most starts turning. That is a strange kind of patience for a network cartoon to have, the patience to teach its audience how to read a visual language they will not be tested on for a long time yet. Watching it again with everything that comes later already known, you can feel the series doing something closer to instruction than entertainment in these stretches, training you frame by frame on what a memory room looks like, what a threshold between two kinds of reality is supposed to feel like when the camera crosses it. So that later, when Weirdmageddon finally tears the sky open and every rule from this episode gets applied at the scale of an entire town, none of it needs to be explained to you again. You already know the grammar, you learned it here, watching two kids sneak through their uncle's memories looking for a folder of blackmail photographs, in an episode that on the surface reads as one of the series' smaller, funnier detours. This is, I think, one of the more genuinely impressive structural decisions the writers made across the whole series, and it rarely gets credited as such because credit tends to go to the episodes that pay the bill rather than the ones that quietly extend the loan. Dreamscaperers does not feel, on a first watch, like a mythology episode. It feels like a fun premise executed well, kids sneaking through their uncle's head, a con man's secrets laid out room by room, a demon making trouble along the way. It is only in hindsight, once you have watched the finale and understood exactly what kind of being Bill Cipher is, and exactly what a compromised mind is capable of doing to the person living inside it, that this earlier episode reveals itself as the show's own tutorial level, the place where it first shows its hand about how unreality is going to work here, well before it needs you to know. What Dreamscapers really establishes, underneath the plot about the blackmail photos, is the visual vocabulary Gravity Falls is going to keep using every single time it wants to tell you that the ground has stopped being solid. The black and yellow geometry of Bill himself, that flat triangular shape rendered with a single, unblinking eye, becomes the show's shorthand for a specific kind of wrongness from this point forward, so that later, whenever a sliver of yellow light or a triangle drawn in the wrong place shows up in the corner of an otherwise ordinary scene, longtime viewers feel a small jolt of dread the show has fully earned. The non-Euclidean interior, the rooms that connect to other rooms in ways that a tape measure would not agree with, the furniture and door frames drifting free of ordinary weight, all of that becomes reusable architecture too. A visual dialect the animators can drop back into whenever the story needs you to understand, without a line of dialogue explaining it that you are no longer looking at the real world. Every later Trippy sequence in the series, the puppet show that goes wrong, the mansion curse, the finale's warped and burning geography, is speaking a language this one episode taught first, in a lower key with lower stakes, tucked into the middle of a season that most casual viewers would tell you was still mostly about ordinary summer mysteries. It was not. It had already started letting you inside the house with the rules that do not hold, one room at a time, and it would be a long while yet before the story asked you to notice. If Dreamscaperers taught the show and taught its audience what the inside of a mind could look like when the walls stopped agreeing to hold still, then the episode that follows it in this walk through the series takes that same idea and does something colder with it. Society of the Blind Eye, said by most accounts to be the 7th episode of the 2nd season, is not set inside anyone's dream. It is set in the actual town, in broad daylight, among people the twins have known all summer. And what it reveals is that Gravity Falls has been running a second, invisible operation underneath its ordinary one the entire time. An operation whose entire purpose is to make sure nobody in town remembers too much. The plot, stripped down to its bones, goes like this. Dipper and the others uncover the existence of a secret society, one that has been at work for years, erasing the memories of Gravity Falls residents whenever those residents get too close to the supernatural truth of the place. This is not a metaphor, and it is not implied. The show gives it a device. A specific handheld apparatus, a memory ray gun, is used to remove a targeted memory directly out of a person's head. And once removed, that memory does not simply vanish into narrative convenience the way memory loss so often does in other stories. It becomes a physical object. The removed memory is stored inside a glass tube, sealed, labeled in the show's visual shorthand as something retrievable, something with mass and shape, and then that tube is sent away through a pneumatic delivery system to a place it calls the Hall of the Forgotten. I want to slow down on that detail because it is the kind of thing that is easy to let slide past in a first watch and much harder to shake once you actually picture it. That hall is not a metaphor either. It is depicted as a real room, a repository, shelf after shelf of these glass tubes, each one holding a specific stolen piece of somebody's life. Whole afternoons, conversations, the sight of something in the woods that scared a person badly enough that they needed to stop knowing it happened. All of it cataloged, all of it stored, all of it sitting there glowing faintly in the dark like some kind of civic archive nobody voted to create. For a family cartoon aimed at children who are themselves at the age where memory is still being built, still soft and half-formed, this is a genuinely unsettling image to put on screen, and the show does not soften it with a joke the way it often does elsewhere. It just lets the shelves sit there, lit and enormous, and lets you do the math yourself about how many lives are represented in that room. The character who anchors this episode emotionally and who the show has been treating as pure comic relief for most of the run-up to this point is Old Man McGucket. Up until Society of the Blind Eye, McGucket has functioned as the town's resident eccentric, a cackling inventor type prone to nonsense and slapstick, the sort of background character a lesser show would never bother giving an interior life to at all. This episode takes that comic figure and quietly detonates him. It reveals that McGucket was not always the town's harmless fool. He was, in fact, an assistant to the author of the journals, a serious collaborator in serious, dangerous work, present for whatever it was that happened during those research years in Gravity Falls that the rest of the town still does not understand. And then something happened to him. The show does not spell out every detail of the incident that broke him, and I'm not going to invent specifics the episode itself does not confirm, but the shape of it is clear enough. Whatever he witnessed, or whatever he did, was bad enough that McGucket chose, deliberately, to build the very device the society now uses and to turn it on himself first. He erased his own memory of it. And because memory does not come out cleanly, because removing one specific afternoon from a person's head apparently takes a great deal more of the surrounding material with it, McGucket is left afterward unable to remember anything from more than roughly 30 years back by the show's own account. His entire adult history before that point is simply gone, not misplaced, not repressed in the ordinary human sense, but physically removed and sitting somewhere in a glass tube that may or may not still exist. Once you know that, you cannot watch McGucket the same way again. Every cackle, every half-sentence trailing off into nonsense, every wild-eyed non-sequitur he has delivered up to this point in the series retroactively reads differently. He is not simply the town's colorful lunatic. He is a man who took a hammer to his own memory rather than live with whatever he had seen, and who has been living in the wreckage of that decision, cheerfully, obliviously, for decades, because the tool he used to protect himself worked exactly as designed and left him without the context to even grieve what he lost. That is a genuinely dark foundation to build a joke character on, and the show waits a long time, over a full season, before it tells you it was there the whole time. What makes this episode trippy, rather than simply sad or simply spooky, is the specificity of the mechanism, and I think this is worth sitting with directly. A lot of children's television has used amnesia as a plot device before. The convenient bump on the head, the vague curse, the fairy tale sleep. Gravity Falls does not do that here. It gives memory loss rules. It gives it a delivery system, a storage protocol, a physical location with shelves, and presumably some kind of indexing, because you do not build the Hall of the Forgotten without some way of finding anything in it again later. It gives it an entire organization, a society with members, and presumably some kind of governance, operating under the town's daylight life the way a municipal water system operates under a street, invisible until you know to look for the manhole covers. That bureaucratic, procedural quality is what tips this from spooky into something closer to disorienting. Spooky is a ghost in an attic. This is a filing system for a town's collective trauma, run by people who apparently agreed among themselves at some point that this was an acceptable thing to maintain, and who have been maintaining it competently enough that almost nobody in Gravity Falls has ever noticed. It gives it a delivery system, a storage protocol, a physical location with shelves, and presumably some kind of indexing. because you do not build the Hall of the Forgotten without some way of finding anything in it again later. It gives it an entire organization, a society with members and presumably some kind of governance, operating under the town's daylight life the way a municipal water system operates under a street, invisible until you know to look for the manhole covers. That bureaucratic, procedural quality is what tips this from spooky into something closer to disorienting. Spooky is a ghost in an attic. This is a filing system for a town's collective trauma, run by people who apparently agreed among themselves at some point that this was an acceptable thing to maintain, and who have been maintaining it competently enough that almost nobody in Gravity Falls has ever noticed. And that is the detail that recolors everything if you let it. This is not one mad scientist working alone in a basement, the sort of isolated villain a story can defeat and then move past. It is described in the show as a society, plural, organized, presumably with some kind of continuity and recruitment, and rules for who gets erased and who gets left alone and who decides. The implication sitting underneath the episode's plot, and I want to be careful to flag this as the show's own suggestion rather than something it states outright in a line of dialogue, is that an entire invisible civic system has been running in this town for years, deciding on behalf of its citizens which parts of their own lives they are allowed to keep. That is a much stranger and much more disturbing idea than a single villain doing a single bad thing, because a single villain can be stopped, while a system implies structure, implies precedent, implies that somebody built this on purpose and other people have been keeping it running ever since. The way any institution keeps running long after its original justification has faded into something nobody working inside it even remembers anymore. Which, given what the society actually does for a living, might be the darkest joke the whole episode is quietly making without ever saying it out loud. Once that image of the hall sits in your head, it becomes very hard not to look back at the entire rest of the series so far and wonder what you were not being shown. Every cheerful summer afternoon Dipper and Mabel have had up to this point. Every background character who waved at them on the street, every adult in Gravity Falls who has ever seemed just slightly too relaxed about the genuinely alarming things happening in these woods, all of it sits under new suspicion once you know that forgetting, in this town, is not always something that just happens to a person. Sometimes it is something that is done to them, on purpose, by neighbors, for reasons the neighbors themselves may not fully remember anymore either. This is the episode that turns Gravity Falls, the location, into a kind of unreliable narrator in its own right, a town that has been curating what its own residents are permitted to carry around in their heads, and it does this in an episode with no dream sequence at all, no portal, no demon, nothing you could point to as fantastical in the traditional sense. It achieves its trippiness entirely through implication and infrastructure, through the sheer procedural weight of glass tubes on shelves, and that is, to me, a more sophisticated piece of writing than a hallucination sequence would have been, because it trusts the audience to feel the vertigo of the idea without needing a single distorted camera angle to sell it. There is also something quietly cruel about where this episode places McGucket relative to the audience. We have been laughing at him. Gravity Falls built him, over many episodes, into a figure it was safe to laugh at. Harmless, a little pathetic, comic relief in the oldest sense of the phrase, there to release tension after a scarier scene. And then it tells us, almost in passing, that the reason he is like this is that he did to himself, deliberately, the single most drastic thing a person can do to protect themselves from an unbearable memory, and that it worked well enough to erase not just the memory, but 30 years of the man who used to hold it. It does not ask you to stop laughing at him afterward, not entirely. Gravity Falls is not interested in punishing its audience for the tone it spent a season building. But it does make the laugh cost something now. It makes the comic relief character carry, permanently, the visible aftermath of a self-inflicted trauma response, and asks you to hold both of those things about him at once, the funny old man and the ruined former scientist, without resolving the tension between them into something simpler. What I keep coming back to about this episode, given where it sits in the run tonight is walking through, is that it marks the first time the show's unreality stops being something that happens to Dipper specifically, inside a mind or a dream or a puppet show, and becomes something structural, something the whole town is subject to whether any individual character ever knows it or not. Dreamscaperers showed us that a single mind could be a maze with rooms in it. Society of the Blind Eye shows us that an entire community can have its collective memory managed the same way, and that the people doing the managing look from the outside like ordinary neighbors going about ordinary lives. That is a colder, more communal version of the same idea, and it is the reason I find this episode sits with me longer than the ghost stories do, because ghosts are supposed to be strange and neighbors are not. There is a version of Gravity Falls that never touches the mindscape at all, never opens a portal, never shows you a single frame of literal hallucination, and is still one of the strangest hours the show ever produced, precisely because the strangeness is not visual. It is Northwest Mansion Mystery, the 10th episode of the 2nd season, and it begins with something almost embarrassingly ordinary by this show's standards. Pacifica Northwest, the wealthy, cold, carefully composed girl who has spent the series so far functioning mostly as Mabel's rival and Dipper's occasional crush, invites Dipper to the family mansion. The Northwests are about to host their annual party, the biggest social event of their calendar, the kind of gathering built entirely to remind the town of Gravity Falls who is rich and who is not. And there is a ghost in the house. Pacifica needs it gone before the guests arrive, because the ghost has started ruining the party preparations, and because an unhappy spirit in the East Wing is, to a family like the Northwests, less a supernatural emergency and more a scheduling conflict. Dipper agrees to help, journal in hand, ready to do what Dipper does, which is treat the impossible as a research problem. What they find as the episode unwinds is not a random haunting. The ghost is the spirit of a lumberjack, and the show reveals carefully that this lumberjack is an ancestor of Wendy's, tying the haunting directly back to one of the series' other families rather than inventing a stranger from nowhere. Generations back, the Northwests wronged this man. The mansion itself, it turns out, was built on that betrayal, quite literally founded on land and money the family acquired at someone else's expense. And the lumberjack has been trapped in the house ever since, furious, unable to rest, showing up now specifically because the one night a year the Northwests perform their own importance to the entire town is the one night he can make that hypocrisy impossible to ignore. It is a classic haunted house setup on its surface, a wronged spirit, an ancestral debt come due, a party under threat of ruin. But Gravity Falls rarely stays on the surface of anything for long, and the episode's real subject turns out not to be the ghost at all. It is Pacifica. Because to break the curse, to get the ghost to leave and let the party go on, someone in the family has to genuinely change, has to break the pattern of shame and cruelty that the haunting is punishing them for. And the person who ends up in a position to do that is not Pacifica's father, who is far too invested in appearances to bend, but Pacifica herself, and the way the episode stages her arc is, where Northwest Mansion Mystery earns its place in a chapter about trippy episodes even though nothing in it is visually surreal. Because what the episode shows you in flashback and in small present tense moments around the house is that Pacifica has been trained. Not raised in the ordinary sense, not disciplined the way a normal parent disciplines a child, but conditioned in something close to the clinical sense of that word. There are scenes built around the idea of a bell or a cue, some small triggering stimulus, followed by an immediate correction if Pacifica's posture slips, if her smile is not perfect, if she slouches or forgets which fork to use or says something unguarded. It plays deliberately like something out of a psychology textbook, the kind of behavioral shaping you would use on an animal. And the show is not shy about the comparison. Pacifica has spent her entire life being trained the way you would train a dog to sit, except what she has been trained to perform is politeness, status, the appearance of effortless wealth, the specific, exhausting choreography of being a Northwest in public. And she has internalized it so completely that by the time we meet her in the series, it does not look like training anymore. It looks like her personality. It looks like a genuinely cold, snobbish girl who happens to have been born into money. The episode's real reveal is that this was manufactured deliberately over years by people who needed her to be exactly this in order to keep performing their own status to the town. And honestly, that reveal unsettles me more than the ghost does, because a haunted mansion is a familiar shape and a childhood engineered for someone else's image is not. Pacifica has spent her entire life being trained the way you would train a dog to sit, except what she has been trained to perform is politeness, status, the appearance of effortless wealth, the specific, exhausting choreography of being a Northwest in public. She has internalized it so completely that by the time we meet her in the series, it does not look like training anymore. It looks like her personality, like a genuinely cold, snobbish girl who happens to have been born into money. The episode's real reveal is that this was manufactured deliberately over years by people who needed her to be exactly this in order to keep performing their own status to the town. And honestly, that reveal unsettles me more than the ghost does, because a haunted mansion is a familiar shape, and a childhood engineered for someone else's image is not. That single moment recasts everything Pacifica has done in earlier episodes. Every eye roll, every cutting comment about the Pines twins, every flicker of practiced disdain now reads not as who she is, but as the visible output of a system running on her. A system her parents built and maintained, and that she has never had the chance to test against anything else. The climax of the episode is built entirely around whether she can override it in the moment that matters most, when the ghost has essentially taken over the party, and the only way to end the haunting is for someone to publicly break the family's core rule, which is never let anyone beneath your station into the house. So the ending stages this as something almost physical. There are literal gates, locked, guarding the mansion from the townspeople who have been kept out for generations. The ordinary people of Gravity Falls, the Northwests, have always treated as beneath the party's guest list. In the moment of crisis, Pacifica is the one standing at those gates, and everything in her training, every bell and correction and year of enforced posture, is telling her to keep them shut, to protect the family's image at any cost, because that is the only lesson she has ever consistently been taught. She opens them anyway. She lets the town in. She lets the ordinary people her family has spent generations excluding walk into the house that was built, in part on excluding people exactly like them. That choice, that one physical, small, completely earned act of letting the gates swing open, is what breaks the curse. The ghost is satisfied. The betrayal is answered not with money, not with an apology issued by a Northwest publicist, but with an actual redistribution of who gets to be inside the walls. It is a small gesture with an enormous amount of narrative weight loaded onto it, and it works, because the show has spent the whole episode building the case that Pacifica, breaking her conditioning even once, even for one night, is a genuinely brave, hard-won thing for her to do. Not a simple moral correction a nicer kid would have made without thinking. There are a few smaller details the episode lays down along the way that matter more than they look like they should. Pacifica's father, Preston Northwest, is named on screen here for what appears to be the first time in the series, which sounds like trivia until you notice what it does structurally, giving the family's cruelty a specific face and a specific name to attach it to rather than leaving it as a vague institutional pressure. We also learned Pacifica's own middle name, Elise, a small human detail dropped into an episode that is otherwise mostly about how little of Pacifica has ever been allowed to be small or human, and we learn that she once held the title of Miss Gravity Falls, which tells you, without the episode needing to spell it out, that this performance of perfection has been formally judged, ranked, and rewarded her entire life, that there has always been an external system validating exactly the conditioning her parents installed. None of this is dwelled on for long. Gravity Falls rarely explains its own implications out loud. It just lets these facts sit there, in the corners of the episode, thickening the sense that every person in this family, not just Pacifica, is carrying an entire inner history that we have only been shown the very edge of. Here's the argument I want to make about why this episode belongs in the same conversation as a memory-erasing secret society or a boy losing control of his own body to a demon, even though on the surface it looks like a fairly conventional haunted house plot with a message about kindness bolted onto the end. Northwest Mansion. Mystery is trippy the way a nightmare about your own family can be trippy, which is to say, it is not about the impossible. It is about the uncanny familiar, the sense that the people closest to you have been shaped by something you cannot quite see and would not recognize even if you were looking directly at it. The show does not need a portal or a mind demon to make this land, because the actual mechanism, behavioral conditioning, generational shame, a family curating its own bloodline down to the posture and vocabulary of its children, is horrifying enough entirely on its own, dressed up in the coziest possible packaging of a period costume party and a haunted mansion plot. And this is where I think this episode quietly rhymes with the memory-wiping conspiracy from Society of the Blind Eye, a rhyme that works precisely because the show never once points it out. One story hides its curation behind a machine and a locked storage facility, erasing what an entire town is allowed to remember of its own history. This one hides it behind a family's private curriculum of bells, posture corrections, and years of enforced smiling, controlling not a town's memory but a single child's entire self. Different scale, different machinery, same underlying architecture. Both stories are, at bottom, about adults building systems to control what the people around them are allowed to remember or become or feel, and both put a child, Dipper in one case, Pacifica in the other, in the position of discovering that the system exists at all, which is very often the hardest part. McGucket did not know he had been erased until the truth came looking for him. Pacifica did not know her personality had been built for her, not entirely, not until the ghost of a wronged man forced the whole family's history into the open in one night. The horror in both cases is not the ghost, and it is not the memory-wiping device. It is the realization that came before either of those things could even become a plot, that something has been rewriting a person for years, invisibly, with that person's full and unknowing cooperation. What strikes me most, watching this episode as part of tonight's run rather than on its own, is how consistently Gravity Falls keeps finding new, literal machinery for the exact same old feeling. It is a feeling most people carry somewhere, the suspicion that the adults you grew up trusting were shaped by pressures you never got to see, that your own parents were themselves someone's project before they ever became yours, and that the version of them you know might not be the only version that was ever possible. The show could have left that feeling as atmosphere, the vague unease that sits under most stories about families and legacies. Instead, it keeps building it a body. Sometimes that body is a ray gun in a hall of glass tubes. Sometimes it is a demon in a puppet show. And sometimes, as it is here, it is nothing stranger than a bell, a corrected posture, and a childhood spent learning exactly which smile to wear at exactly which moment, until the girl wearing it forgets there was ever a choice involved. Of everything in this episode, that is the detail I keep circling back to, because it is the version of that unreality that requires no special effects budget at all. You do not need a portal to be haunted by something that was built into you before you were old enough to notice it happening. The trippiest hour of Season 2 does not open with anything supernatural. It opens with Mabel deciding, on her own initiative and for reasons that are entirely her own, that she is going to put on a puppet show. There is a boy, his name is Gabe Benson, and he does the kind of things that make an 11-year-old's heart do something complicated, quoting his own home movies and performing little bits of magic with total, humorless sincerity, and Mabel decides that the way into his heart is through felt and glued on googly eyes. She writes and rehearses an entire miniature production for him, something she titles, in the specific and slightly absurd way only Mabel would title anything, Glove Story, a sock opera. It is a small story sitting inside a bigger one, a girl performing a play about love for an audience of one. And it would be a perfectly serviceable episode of television on its own. Gentle and a little silly, the kind of plot beat this show hands to Mabel every so often to let her carry the whole episode for 20 minutes. Except this time it is stitched, deliberately and without warning, to the single worst decision Dipper makes in the entire series. Because while Mabel is threading yarn hair onto a sock, Dipper is upstairs with a locked laptop. This is the author's laptop, the one connected to the third journal, and to everything Dipper has spent 2 seasons trying to pry open. And by this point in the season, he is close, closer than he has ever been, close enough that the not knowing has started to feel unbearable in the specific way that almost knowing something always does. He needs a password he cannot guess and a lock he cannot pick. And so he does the thing that every horror story since the beginning of horror stories has been built to warn you against. He goes looking for a shortcut, and the shortcut finds him first. Bill Cipher turns up the way he always turns up in these early appearances, inside a dream, folding the geography of Dipper's own sleeping mind into that same jittering, hand-drawn black and yellow arrangement of shapes Gravity Falls established back in Dreamscaperers. Bill is friendly, and that friendliness is worth pausing on because in hindsight, knowing everything this character eventually becomes, it is easy to forget how charming his first offers are. He does not threaten Dipper, he does not need to. He simply notices what Dipper wants more than almost anything else right now, and he offers to hand it over, for a price so small it barely registers as a price at all. One night, access to Dipper's body while Dipper sleeps, so that a demon with hands can, for once, however briefly, do a demon's business in the physical world. In exchange, the laptop opens. What makes this frightening rather than simply villainous is how carefully the episode sets the trade up as reasonable. Dipper is not being tricked by fine print. He understands roughly what he is agreeing to, and he agrees anyway because the thing dangled in front of him answers a question that has eaten most of his summer. This is not a boy being fooled. This is a boy making a bad trade with his eyes half open, the way people make bad trades in real life. Not because they cannot see the risk, but because the thing on the other side of the risk feels, in the moment, worth it. Bill takes the handshake, his signature blue flame flickering around the deal being sealed, and in one conversation, the episode has quietly loaded the gun the rest of the season is going to fire. What happens next is the stretch of sock opera that people who grew up on this series tend to describe first because it is the strangest extended piece of animation Gravity Falls produces, before the finale rearranges the whole town. Bill takes the body, and the story does not cut away from this, does not soften it into an off-screen implication, the way a nervous network note might have preferred. It stays on Dipper's actual physical body, moving wrong. One eye flattens and narrows into a vertical slit, Bill's shape bleeding directly into a 12-year-old's features, in a way that reads, even now, as something closer to invasion than transformation. His voice drops and stretches into Bill's cadence, that theatrical, delighted, faintly cruel register coming out of Dipper's own mouth. His posture goes loose and puppet-like, joints swinging at angles a real boy's joints do not move at, an arm swinging with a gleeful looseness that reads as wrong before your brain can articulate why. This is a children's cartoon letting one of its two lead characters stop looking like himself on screen for minutes at a stretch, without explaining the wrongness away with a joke. It just lets you sit in it. This is the moment worth naming plainly because it does not get named enough when people talk about the series' darker corners. It is arguably the purest body horror sequence Gravity Falls produces before Weirdmageddon tears the whole dimension open. Not the scariest image, not the largest in scale, but the most precise. Because body horror at its best is never really about the monster wearing the skin. It is about the specific cellular wrongness of watching someone you know stop being fully present behind their own face. Watching the machinery keep running while the person who used to drive it sits locked somewhere you cannot see. Dreamscaperers gave the series a language for what a mind looks like from the inside. The Society of the Blind Eye episode gave it a mechanism for what happens when a mind gets edited. Sock opera is the first time that same unease turns directly onto a body its audience has spent 2 full seasons learning to trust, and lets something else drive it around while the real occupant is, for all the story initially shows us, somewhere else entirely. What Bill does with the body is, in its own way, worse than any single violent act could have been because it is so small and so calculated. He does not rampage. He goes hunting, using Dipper's own hands and Dipper's own access, for the very thing Dipper wanted opened in the first place, except now working entirely on Bill's terms rather than Dipper's, poking around where Dipper never agreed he could poke, treating the body like a tool that happens to have fingers rather than a person who happens to be asleep inside it. It is a betrayal built entirely out of politeness. Bill never breaks the letter of the deal. He simply demonstrates, over one long, off-kilter night, exactly how much damage a demon can do while staying scrupulously inside the boundaries of a promise a child did not fully understand he was making. Meanwhile, downstairs, Mabel is doing the puppet show, and this is where the episode does something very few pieces of children's television would have the nerve to attempt. It keeps cutting back to Glove Story, a sock opera performed with total earnestness for an audience of one distracted boy, while her twin brother is upstairs being worn like a costume. The tonal distance between these two threads should not work. A love-struck girl rehearsing puppet dialogue about a snail wizard falling for a mummy princess, intercut with body horror possession happening one floor above her, is the kind of juxtaposition that in lesser hands reads as tonal whiplash in the bad sense, as though the writers forgot which episode they were making. Instead, it plays as exactly what it is, one household containing two entirely different emergencies at once, each character fully immersed in the crisis they can see and blind to the one they cannot. Gravity Falls trusts its audience to feel the gap between those two realities without being told to feel it. That trust is, I think, the real accomplishment of this episode, more than the possession effects themselves. Comedy and horror sitting directly next to each other, scene by scene, without a laugh track or a tonal safety rail to tell a young viewer how to feel about the transition, is a very specific kind of confidence for a series aimed at a Saturday morning audience. It assumes the viewer can hold both things in their head, the sweetness of Mabel's crush story and the genuine dread of what is happening to Dipper, without one canceling the other out. And it turns out kids could hold that. Sock opera is remembered fondly by exactly the demographic it was ostensibly protecting from anything too intense. How the deal eventually resolves matters less, scene by scene, than what it does to the twins' relationship going forward. Mabel figures out something is deeply wrong with her brother before he can tell her anything, because she knows him well enough to see the wrongness even filtered through a body that is technically still his. The two of them, working together, force the situation back under control, and that matters because it means Dipper does not get himself out of this alone. He gets pulled out by the one person in his life who has spent her entire summer being underestimated next to his research and his journals and his need to have the answer to everything. It is Mabel's instinct, not Dipper's cleverness, that ends the episode, and there is something satisfying in that small correction to the season's usual balance of who gets to be the competent one. But what actually matters for the rest of the series is not how the deal ends, it is that it happened at all. Up to this point, Bill has largely operated as an idea, a menace glimpsed in dreams, a name whispered in journal margins, a triangle drawn in the corner of a page warning the reader in block letters not to trust him. Sock opera is the moment that warning becomes personal and specific. Dipper does not learn in the abstract that Bill Cipher is dangerous. He learns it from the inside, having felt what it is to hand over the wheel for what he thought was one manageable night, and discover that manageable was never really on the table. That kind of lesson does not fade the way a scary story fades. It becomes a permanent adjustment to how a character reads every future interaction with the same figure, and Gravity Falls never walks it back. Every scene from this point forward in which Bill appears friendly, reasonable, willing to make another deal, carries this episode underneath it as a kind of scar tissue on Dipper's trust, whether or not the dialogue ever references it directly. This is, I think, the real reason sock opera earns its place among the show's trippiest hours, more than the visual strangeness of the possession itself. It is not just that Gravity Falls let its camera linger on a warped, borrowed body for an unusually long stretch of a children's cartoon, though it did, and that alone would justify the episode's reputation. It used that image to permanently change the emotional terms between its two central characters and the entity that will eventually try to end their world. Every trade Bill offers after this point, every whispered deal, every reasonable-sounding proposal delivered with that same theatrical charm, now exists in the shadow of the one time a version of it was actually accepted, and the cost turned out to be a stolen night inside a 12-year-old's own skin. When Weirdmageddon finally arrives and Bill's ambitions stop being personal and start being planetary, the emotional groundwork for why Dipper refuses to ever again treat him as anything other than a threat was laid here, quietly, in an episode, ostensibly about a sock puppet crush story months earlier, while nobody in the audience was necessarily bracing for it to matter that much. Sock opera is a story about a body being borrowed for one night. The episode that follows it is a story about an entire life being borrowed for decades, and it is a completely different kind of strange, because there is no dream sequence here, no visible warp in the picture, nobody's eye rolling gold, nobody's voice dropping into that theatrical drawl that means Bill is speaking through someone else's mouth. Not What He Seems, the 11th episode of Season 2, first broadcast on March the 9th, 2015, does not look trippy at all while it's happening. It looks like a crime drama, and that is exactly the point. By the time the credits roll, the ground the entire series has been standing on for a season and a half has been quietly pulled away, and the show never puts it back. The plot, on its surface, is almost procedural. Grunkle Stan is arrested. The specific charge, confirmed by the episode itself, is theft. The removal of radioactive waste from a nearby plant, an accusation strange enough on its own for a man who runs a roadside tourist trap, and two government agents, Powers and Trigger, take him into custody after their equipment picks up readings coming from somewhere underneath his house. Dipper and Mabel, doing what the show has trained them and us to do at this stage of the season, decide the answer is to go looking for evidence that clears him. They break into his study, convinced that if they just dig hard enough, they will find the thing that proves their great uncle is innocent: a receipt, an alibi, something boring and reassuring. What they find instead is worse than guilt. It is stranger than guilt. They find a drawer full of identification cards, each one carrying Stan's face and a different name, a small paper trail of a man who has apparently been more than one legal person for longer than either of them has been alive. They find blueprints tucked away that do not belong to a con artist's shop. They belong to something much larger and much stranger sitting beneath the floor of the house they have been sleeping in all summer. I want to slow down on that beat specifically because it is the moment the episode earns its reputation. The twins go looking for reassurance and instead find fresh evidence that the man raising them for the summer has been lying about who he is for their entire lives and for a long time before that. There is no monster in this scene. There is no supernatural threat cornering them in a hallway. The horror, if that is even the right word for it, is bureaucratic and domestic, a drawer of paperwork. And it lands harder than most of the show's actual monsters ever do because it cannot be fought or outrun. You cannot punch a fake identification card. You can only sit there holding it, doing the arithmetic on how much of what you thought you knew was true. By the end of the episode, the government agents have Stan in custody because of what their instruments detected humming beneath his house. And the show delivers the reveal that the season has been building toward without either Twin or the audience, fully realizing how close it was standing this whole time. The man they have called Grunkle Stan since the pilot episode is not simply a con man with a record and some petty aliases stacked up behind him. He has been living for years under an identity that used to belong to somebody else, a twin brother, a person the show has never once mentioned by that name up to this point despite having had 30 episodes to do it in. That is the actual size of the reveal. It is not a plot twist about a crime. It is a twist about a person, about the basic biographical facts of a character the audience had already spent a season and a half assuming they fully understood. The audience's reaction to this in real time is documented, and it backs up what the episode feels like from the inside. Not What He Seems is, by the numbers, the second highest rated episode of the entire series, trailing only the finale itself, or so the ratings figures that circulate among fans suggest. That is not a small thing for an episode with no giant monster, no possession, no dream sequence, nothing you could put on a poster. It landed on the strength of a single sentence's worth of information, changing everything else around it, and the audience watching week to week felt that shift happen the way you feel. A floor tilt slightly under your feet before you understand why. The show is careful, in the episodes that follow this one, to lay the family history out properly. And it matters that we get this right because it is precisely the kind of detail that gets flattened or confused in casual retelling. There are 3 journals. All 3 of them were written by the same person, Stanford Pines, the twin brother whose existence this episode finally surfaces, the original researcher who spent years cataloging the paranormal life of the town before vanishing from it. Journal number 2 did not stay with him. It passed out of his hands and eventually into the possession of Gideon Gleeful, the town's pint-sized con artist and self-styled psychic, before Stan wound up in control of it later on. Journal number 3 is the one that actually drives the series we have been watching. The one Dipper finds abandoned in the woods in the very first episode. The one that has been guiding the twins' entire summer of investigation without either of them realizing whose handwriting they were actually reading. None of these 3 books were written by the man they call Grunkle Stan. They were written by his brother. Stan, throughout all of this, was never the author of anything. He was something closer to the author's opposite. The man left behind holding the evidence, protecting a secret he did not create and could not fully explain, for reasons the show had not yet let anyone say out loud. This is worth sitting with for a moment on its own terms, separate from the plot mechanics, because it is doing something genuinely different from every other kind of strangeness Gravity Falls has used so far. Dreamscaperers took us inside a literal mind and showed us memory rendered as architecture. Society of the Blind Eye showed us memory removed and stored as physical objects on a shelf. Sock opera showed us a body with somebody else briefly steering it from behind the eyes. All three of those are structurally hallucinations, images built specifically to represent something happening beneath the surface of a person. Not What He Seems does not give you an image like that at all. It gives you a filing cabinet. The disorientation it produces is arguably worse than any of the visual ones because it is not confined to a dream sequence or a possessed body that eventually gets returned to its rightful owner by the end of the episode. It infects your memory of every previous episode you have already watched. Every scene of Stan running the mystery shack, every scrappy scheme, every gruff moment of affection toward the twins, all of it now needs to be reread with the knowledge that the man performing those scenes was protecting something enormous the entire time. Something it had been hiding in plain sight since its very first minutes. That, I think, is the actual argument for why this episode belongs in a conversation about the trippiest hours in the whole series, even though nothing in it bends visually or supernaturally at all. Trippy, in the register this essay has been building all night, does not only mean dream logic and warped geometry and possessed bodies. It can also mean the much quieter vertigo of discovering that the reality you had accepted as stable and fully explained was, this whole time, a performance being staged for your benefit by someone standing just off screen. A staged reality is arguably more disorienting than a hallucinated one because a hallucination announces itself. It has a visual language that tells you something unusual is happening. The black and yellow geometry, the glowing tubes in the Hall of the Forgotten, the wrong-colored eye. A performance does not announce itself. It looks exactly like ordinary life until the exact moment someone hands you the paperwork that proves it was not. What genuinely changes how I think about rewatching Gravity Falls is that Not What He Seems does not just add one new fact to the pile. It effectively splits the entire series in two. There is a version of the series, the one that exists for a viewer watching for the very first time, in which Grunkle Stan is simply Stan, a gruff, greedy, surprisingly tender old man running a tourist trap and raising 2 kids for the summer because family asked him to. And there is a second version of the exact same footage, available only in retrospect, in which every single scene involving him is quietly about a man protecting a hidden brother, maintaining a fiction that has cost him decades, standing guard over a locked door in his own basement that the camera has been filming around the edges of since the very first episode without ever looking directly at it. Both versions are technically the same episodes, the same lines, the same jokes, the same reaction shots. But they do not feel like the same show. Once you know what Not What He Seems is actually revealing, you cannot watch the earlier episodes the old way again. His impatience reads differently. His evasiveness about the basement reads differently. Even his affection for the twins starts to read as something closer to a man clinging to the one part of his life that is not built on a lie, because it is the only part of it he gets to have honestly. That's a rare thing for a family cartoon to pull off, and I do not think it gets talked about with the same enthusiasm as the finale's monsters or Bill's yellow eye because it does not photograph well. You cannot put this episode's twist on a thumbnail the way you can put a demon tearing the sky open on one. But structurally, this is where the show commits fully to the idea that the ordinary, familiar adult at the center of a children's summer adventure story might be the strangest and least stable thing in the entire town. Stranger than any ghost, stranger than any memory ray. Because everything about him was designed, from the very first frame he appeared in, to be looked at and not quite seen for what it actually was. Everything up to this point in the season has been a kind of rehearsal for a single afternoon, though nobody watching in real time was told that in so many words. Dreamscaperers taught the audience what the inside of a mind looks like. Society of the Blind Eye taught the audience that memory itself could be treated as an object, something removed, stored, and filed away by people with a system. Northwest Mansion Mystery taught the audience that a family could be haunted less by a ghost than by its own inherited shame. Sock Opera taught the audience what it looks like when something else is wearing a person. Not What He Seems taught the audience that even the most familiar face in the series could be a performance built over a hole in the ground. Each of those lessons stayed contained inside a bedroom, or a basement, or a town hall, or a body, or a mansion behind a gate. What Gravity Falls had never done, not once across 2 seasons, was let all of that unreality out of its container and into the actual daylight streets of the town. That containment breaks in the finale, and it breaks because of the portal. The portal itself has been sitting under the events of the season, the way Stan's secret was sitting under the events of the series. Something built, something buried, something waited on. It is the machine Stanford built decades earlier, and the machine Stan has spent decades guarding. And by the time the season's climax arrives, it gets activated in a way that finally gives Bill Cipher the one thing the earlier chapters of this video kept insisting he did not have: a body, a way through. Every appearance we have walked through tonight, the mind, the memories, the puppet, has depended on Bill working through someone else's interior, borrowing a head or a dream or a night because his own dimension gives him no standing invitation into this one. The rule established back in Dreamscaperers that he cannot simply walk into the real world holds for the entire run of the series right up until the portal opens and gives him exactly the kind of door that rule requires. And once he has that door, he does not walk through it politely. What the wiki record suggests, as far as fans have pieced together across the later episodes, is that Bill Cipher finally secures a physical form through this portal event, and that his arrival is not solitary. He does not step through alone to make one final speech and vanish again the way he sometimes has in dreams. He brings company. The event frees a specific cast of allies who have apparently been waiting on his side of things for who knows how long, and the story names them clearly enough that this is one of the rare places in the whole finale where a viewer does not need to guess at who is who. Teeth, Pyronica, Pacifier, 8-Ball, Amorphous Shape, Keyhole, Cryptos, Hectorgon, Xanthar. 9 names, 9 creatures, released together in the same event that gives Bill his own body. And the effect of naming them this precisely, rather than just calling them a mob of monsters, is that Gravity Falls is treating its own nightmare the way it has treated everything else all season, as something with an internal logic and a cast list rather than as formless chaos. Even the apocalypse gets an itemized guest list. That is such a specific, almost bureaucratic instinct for a story about the literal end of the world, and it tells you something about how the story thinks even when it is screaming. It never stops being organized about its own weirdness. The monsters have names the way the journals have numbers, and the memory tubes have a filing system. Gravity Falls does not really believe in chaos without a clipboard somewhere behind it. Once Bill and his 9 allies are loose, Gravity Falls does something it has been building toward after through every earlier chapter of this video without ever quite doing it at full scale, which is take the visual grammar of the mindscape and lay it directly over the physical town. This is the largest set piece the series ever attempts, and it earns that scale honestly, because it is not introducing a new kind of unreality, it is exporting one. The black and yellow triangle geometry that first appeared inside Stan's head in Dreamscaperers now belongs to the sky itself. The town square, the diner, the shops along the main street, all of it gets rendered wrong on purpose. Buildings tilted at angles that have no structural reason to hold. Geography folding back on itself the way a dream folds when you try to walk somewhere, and the somewhere keeps rearranging itself before you arrive. The series had already taught its audience, patiently over 2 seasons, what that kind of visual wrongness means and how to read it. Now it just turns the volume up until the wrongness is outdoors, in broad view, with nobody's eyes closed and nobody asleep. The weather itself stops behaving like weather. Eyeballs drift through the air the way clouds should, static crackles across the horizon the way heat haze normally would on a hot day, except this static behaves like it has intention, like it is watching. It is the single largest visual escalation in the whole series, and it works, and I think it works specifically because none of it is unfamiliar by the time it arrives. A viewer meeting Gravity Falls for the first time in this one sequence would probably find it disorienting in a generic way, a lot of noise and color without a clear internal grammar. But a viewer who sat through the mindscape rooms, the tubes glowing in the Hall of the Forgotten, the puppet show cut against a possession, the desk drawer full of fake identification recognizes this instantly as the same handwriting scaled up past any reasonable size. Gravity Falls is not introducing you to a new nightmare. It is taking every nightmare it already showed you quietly, one room and one mind and one file cabinet at a time, and letting them all breathe the same air at once. I want to be careful here about exactly how much of the final act's mechanics I claim with confidence, because the deeper machinery of the last stretch of the finale, the specific turns the plot takes to actually get Bill defeated, involves a lot of moving pieces across multiple episodes that fan retellings summarize with varying levels of precision, And this is exactly the kind of terrain where it is easy to state something confidently that turns out to be slightly off from what actually aired. What can be said plainly, and what the broad shape of the story supports without needing to reconstruct every individual beat, is that the confrontation with Bill in the end is not something any one member of the family manages alone. The twins, their great uncles, and the people around them in town end up on the same side of the same fight, working from what they each individually know, rather than from any single overwhelming weapon. And the resolution the show reaches for is not really a resolution built on force in the way you might expect from a story that has just spent an entire act destroying its own town. It leans instead on trust and memory, on people believing each other and remembering things about each other that Bill, for all his reach into minds and dreams, does not actually have access to. That is the load-bearing idea of the ending, even without walking through every step of how it gets executed. And it is a genuinely satisfying place for a season built this heavily on secrets and erased memory to land, because it means the thing that finally stops the demon who has spent 2 seasons living inside people's heads is the one kind of knowledge he was never able to steal. There is a piece of trivia that circulates around this ending that I think is worth naming here, carefully, because it says something true about how fragile these endings are even after they are written, but it needs to be flagged exactly for what it is, which is secondhand fan discussion about the writer's room rather than anything the series itself confirms on screen. The claim, as it gets repeated in fan analysis and community discussion around the finale, is that at some earlier stage of planning, it was not Bill who was originally going to die in the climactic confrontation, but Mabel. I have no way to verify that claim against a primary interview or a production document, and neither research nor the wiki record I am working from confirms it as anything more than something fans have pieced together and passed along. So I'm not going to narrate it as though it happened, because it did not happen, not on screen and not in any confirmed official statement I can point to. What aired is Bill's ending, not Mabel's. But the fact that this rumor persists at all, whether or not it is accurate, tells you something about how close to the bone this finale reads to its audience. People do not invent alternate death rumors for endings that felt safe. They invent them for endings that felt, even in their relief, like they were one wrong turn away from actually costing the family something permanent. Whether or not that particular version of the writer's room ever existed, the fact that so many people wanted to believe it might have is its own kind of evidence for how seriously the show had trained its audience to expect real cost by this point in the story. What I keep coming back to, thinking about why this finale lands the way it does instead of feeling like a random explosion of spectacle bolted onto the end of a small-town mystery, is that none of it is new information. That is the whole trick of it, and it is a trick a lot of finales do not manage. A weaker version of this story could have introduced Weirdmageddon as a surprise, a twist genre Gravity Falls had never played in before, monsters and apocalypse imagery arriving out of nowhere because the writers wanted a big finish. That is not what happens here. Every single ingredient of the finale had already been shown to the audience in a smaller, quieter, contained form earlier in the run. And the finale's only real innovation is scale. Take the triangle geometry. It is not new, it is the geometry from inside Stan's head. The idea of memory carrying real weight and consequence is not new either, since Society of the Blind Eye had already spent an entire episode building it. Nor is the idea of a family's hidden shame turning physical and needing to be confronted directly rather than avoided. That is exactly what Pacifica had to do at her own gate. Something else wearing a familiar face, and the horror of watching that face stop behaving like itself is sock opera's idea, borrowed rather than invented for this finale. And the notion that the ordinary adult at the center of this small town had been hiding an entire second reality underneath the one you thought you were watching is simply Stan's arrest playing out again at a much larger size. Weirdmageddon does not ask the audience to learn a new kind of fear. It asks the audience to recognize every fear it has already learned, all operating at once in the open at the size of the sky. That is why it feels inevitable rather than arbitrary. A truly random finale would feel like an ambush. This one feels like a debt finally being called in, because in a very real sense it is one. The show spent 2 seasons quietly cashing checks it wrote in its very first descent into a dream. This is also, I think, the reason the finale is allowed to be as visually strange as it is without ever losing its audience the way a lot of shows do when they try to go bigger than their own established scale. Because the audience is never actually confused by what is happening on screen, even at its most disorienting, even with eyeballs drifting through the sky and buildings folding at angles no building should fold at. They have already been given the dictionary for this. Dreamscapers taught them how to read a mind rendered as architecture. The memory tubes taught them how to read an idea rendered as a physical object with weight and storage. The possession sequence taught them how to read a familiar face behaving like it belongs to someone else. By the time all three of those visual languages show up simultaneously in the finale, layered over an actual town instead of a private mind or a private body, the audience already has the fluency to parse it instinctively, even if they could not necessarily explain why it reads the way it does. That fluency is the payoff of everything this video has walked through tonight. The show was never randomly weird. It was teaching a visual and emotional vocabulary in installments. One contained nightmare at a time, and it saved the full sentence for the very end. There is something almost generous about that structure when you sit with it a little. A lesser show might have wanted to save its strangest ideas for the finale exclusively, holding them back so the ending would feel like a shock nobody could have predicted. Gravity Falls does the opposite. It spends its strangest ideas early and often in small contained doses across 2 seasons, trusting that familiarity would make the big swing land harder rather than making it land as less surprising. And it does land harder, precisely because none of it is arriving cold. The town coming apart at the end of the story does not feel like the show suddenly deciding to become a different kind of program. It feels like the last, loudest verse of a song it had been softly humming since the very first time somebody walked into somebody else's head and found the furniture rearranged. So let's deal honestly with the ending, because this is where a lot of retellings get sloppy. And getting sloppy here is precisely the kind of thing this channel tries to avoid. The television finale, the actual 2016 broadcast episode that closes out Weirdmageddon and closes out the series, frames Bill Cipher's ending as destruction. Not confinement, not a timeout, not a deal struck behind the scenes. Destruction. The final confrontation is built around a trap laid using the very thing Bill has spent the whole series exploiting, the vulnerability of memory and mind, and the show resolves it by turning his own weapon back on him inside his own head, in a sequence that reads on screen as an ending, full stop. Bill is gone. The threat that has been leaking into dreams and puppets and portals since the middle of season 1 is not managed or postponed. It is finished. That is the primary text. That is what aired. If you are watching Gravity Falls as a completed 2-season, 40-episode work of television, which is what it is, and all it ever officially claimed to be, the story it tells you is that Bill Cipher dies and the twins go home, and the summer ends the way summers actually end, which is to say completely and without a sequel hook. There is a caveat worth stating plainly here, because there is a temptation, especially with a show as beloved and as thoroughly picked apart as this one, to treat everything that has ever been published under its name as equally canonical, equally load-bearing, equally true in the same register. It is not. And this matters more for Bill's ending than for almost anything else in the series, because Bill's ending is the one piece of mythology that got revisited years later in material made after the show had already concluded. But notice how much softening language I just used to describe that, and notice that I used it on purpose. Is said to have struck a bargain, according to this later material, if you take it at face value. That is not caution for its own sake. That is the actual epistemic status of the claim. The Book of Bill is a real object published under the Gravity Falls name, written with direct creative involvement from the people who made the series, and it is reasonable to treat it as an authentic expansion of the show's cosmology rather than some outside fan document. But structurally, it is still after the fact. It exists because the series had already ended, because there was clearly more of Bill's voice and Bill's worldview the creative team wanted to get on paper once the pressure of weekly network television was gone, and because a built-in audience of people exactly like whoever is listening to this right now was hungry for more. None of that makes it untrue within its own frame. It does make it a different kind of source than the 2016 broadcast finale, and a video specifically about the trippiest episodes that actually aired owes you that distinction rather than blurring the two together into one seamless account. So here's the honest, layered version, as plainly as I can state it. On screen, in the series you would actually watch if you sat down and pressed play on all 40 episodes, Bill Cipher is destroyed at the end of Weirdmageddon, and that ending is complete in itself. No gaps, no unresolved thread demanding a sequel. Separately, in supplementary material published after Gravity Falls had already finished its run, that ending gained an additional layer, a version in which destruction was never quite the whole picture, and confinement under the terms of an unseen god's bargain took its place instead. Both of those things can be true as descriptions of two different documents. Only one of them is the ending of the television series Gravity Falls. If you want to know what actually happens on screen, the answer is destruction, stated without hedging, exactly as the finale plays it. If you want to know what a later book says happened after that, in a continuity its creator chose to keep writing once the camera stopped rolling, the answer involves an axolotl, a neutral zone, and a joke that is, depending on how charitable you feel toward Bill, either on him or entirely at his expense. Keep those two answers in separate pockets. Do not let one replace the other in your memory of what actually aired. That is exactly the tidy, confident, slightly invented certainty this channel tries never to hand you. While we are on the subject of things published after Gravity Falls ended, one more object deserves precision, since it gets treated far too loosely in casual conversation about this series: Journal 3 itself. Journal 3, as an in-universe object inside the show, is the specific notebook Dipper finds in the woods in the very first episode, written entirely by Stanford Pines, the one that sets the whole summer in motion by telling two ordinary kids that the town around them is not what it appears to be. That in-universe journal is canon in the most straightforward sense. It is a prop, it drives plot, characters read it on screen and act on what it tells them. But there is also a real-world companion book, published by Disney Publishing and sold to actual audiences in stores, that presents itself as a physical reproduction of that same journal, complete with the handwriting, the marginal notes, and the diagrams, all dressed up to feel like you're holding the actual object Dipper carries around town for 2 seasons. That real-world book was released in July of 2016, several months after the broadcast finale had already aired that February. It is a wonderful object to own. It expands details, lets you sit with Stanford's handwriting at your own pace instead of catching glimpses of it in freeze frame, and rewards exactly the kind of obsessive rewatching this fan base has always been known for. But it is a book released after the series ended, and it did not air. Nothing in it is an episode. Nothing in it happened on screen in front of an audience watching week to week in real time. It is useful, sometimes wonderful context. It is never itself a scene from the series, and treating it as one would be exactly the kind of sleight of hand Gravity Falls itself would probably find a little funny, given how much of its actual plot concerns characters mistaking stage things for real ones. So, with all of that laid out plainly and every source kept in its own labeled box, here is the bigger question to consider as we come toward the end of tonight. Why has this particular string of episodes, the mindscape detours and the memory tubes and the puppet possession and the twin reveal and the sky finally coming apart over a small town in Oregon, stayed so alive in people's heads for this long? Gravity Falls ended in February of 2016. That is not a recent event anymore. An entire childhood has happened since then for a lot of the people who watched it first, at the age it was actually aimed at. And yet here we are, so long after that February ending, still turning its strangest episodes over as though they happened last week, which is its own kind of tribute to a story about staying awake at your own peril. Part of the answer, I think, is the thing this whole night has actually been arguing, chapter after chapter, without ever needing to state it directly until now. Gravity Falls never treated its weirdness as decoration. Almost every trippy sequence in the series is load-bearing. Dreamscaperers is not just an excuse to draw a strange mental landscape. It permanently establishes what the inside of a person's head looks like in this universe. A piece of grammar the story will need again and again, right up through the moment Bill finally gets loose into the actual sky. The memory tubes in the Hall of the Forgotten, discussed earlier, do the same kind of work from a different angle. An entire town's comfort built on a foundation of erased pain, which recolors every cheerful, silly episode that came before it once you actually notice. The possession sequence in the sock puppet episode is not just body horror for shock value. It is the exact moment a demon proves he will honor the letter of a deal while gutting its spirit completely, which is the emotional logic the finale later runs on at full scale. Even the ghost story at the Northwest Mansion, which never touches literal hallucination at all, turns out to be doing the same underlying work as everything around it, showing a family condition like an animal act, machinery built from shame instead of a ray gun, but machinery all the same. None of it is random. All of it teaches you something you will need later, whether you catch it the first time through or not. And underneath every one of those devices, the dream, the memory ray, the possession, the curse, the twin brother behind a wall, the portal to another dimension, sits the same small, ordinary, completely non-trippy fact, which is that two kids are spending a summer with their great uncle before school starts again, and that summer is going to end whether any of this cosmic machinery resolves cleanly or not. That is, I think, the actual trick of Gravity Falls, and it is worth naming plainly instead of leaving it implied, because I think it is the reason this material has outlasted a lot of shows with much bigger, flashier premises. The series could have let its strangeness become the whole point. A lesser version of it exists somewhere in an alternate draft where the mystery box is the entire appeal, where you watch for the next reveal and stop caring about anything once the answers arrive. That is not what actually happens here. Every single trippy sequence this video has walked through tonight, without exception, ties directly back to a relationship. Dipper protects Stan's secret even from inside Stan's own memories. The whole town forgets a good man's tragedy because remembering it hurt too much to carry. Mabel loses her brother's face and voice for one unbearable stretch of an evening and refuses to accept that as permanent. Two brothers, nearly identical except for the extra finger on one of their hands, spend most of their adult lives lying to protect and resent each other in roughly equal measure. Even the literal end of the world, staged with all of Bill's monsters and all of his warped geometry and every piece of visual grammar the series had spent 2 seasons building, resolves through family choosing each other over the easier, more convenient version of surviving alone. It never once uses its weirdness as a substitute for feeling something. It uses the weirdness as the delivery system for feeling something instead, which is a much harder trick to pull off consistently, and it is the trick this whole series somehow never drops, even at its strangest. That is honestly the part that gets me most, turning it all over one more time before we close out. A show could have been given every single piece of this toolkit: the dream demon, the memory erasing gun, the possession, the hidden twin, the actual apocalypse, and used all of it purely for spectacle, purely to keep an audience guessing what happens next. This one used all of it to keep asking a much smaller, much sadder question underneath the noise, which is simply whether the people you love will still recognize you and whether you will still recognize them once all the secrets finally surface. Every trippy episode this video has gone through tonight is really just that question wearing a different costume. Sometimes the costume is a black and yellow triangle floating through somebody's memories. Sometimes it is a glass tube glowing on a shelf in a hidden hallway. Sometimes it is a family standing behind an iron gate they built themselves. Sometimes it is the whole sky splitting open above a small town that never asked to be the center of anything. But it is always the same question, asked over and over in increasingly loud and increasingly strange ways, until the finale finally answers it as directly as the series ever allows itself to. There is something worth noticing in how contained all of this actually is when you step back far enough to see the whole shape of it. Gravity Falls ran for 2 seasons, 40 episodes in total, across a little under 4 years on the air, from June of 2012 to February of 2016, on a network built primarily around half-hour comedies for kids on summer break. Somewhere inside that unglamorous, ordinary production schedule, a strange, sad, and meticulously careful piece of storytelling got made almost entirely on its own terms. It was never built to run indefinitely, and there was no plan for a 3rd season waiting in a drawer somewhere. No continuation quietly shelved by a corporate decision made above anyone's head. The ending you get is the ending that was intended, a story that knew its own shape well enough to stop exactly when it was finished, which is rarer in television than almost anything else this genre usually offers. That kind of discipline is part of why it still gets talked about with this much specificity years later. Nothing about its ending needs defending or explaining away. It simply ends the way a good short story ends, at the one point where stopping actually means something. And it is a strange thing this late at night to think about how a series that spent so much of its runtime pulling the floor out from under its own characters, dreams collapsing into memories, memories collapsing into secrets, secrets collapsing into an actual apocalypse, has ended up being the kind of thing people put on specifically to fall asleep to. There is no contradiction in that if you think about it for more than a second. A show this carefully built rewards being revisited slowly in pieces without the pressure of needing to catch every reveal the first time through, because the reveals were never really the point. The point was always underneath them, in the quieter, sadder thing they were built to protect. You can drift off somewhere in the middle of any one of these episodes tonight and lose nothing, because the actual center of Gravity Falls was never really about staying awake for the next twist. It was about two kids and one strange, temporary summer, and about how much of what makes a family only becomes visible once you have taken the time to look at all the strange, hidden architecture holding it together. That is where I want to leave this one tonight. Gravity Falls got to end exactly the way it wanted to, on its own schedule, having said everything it set out to say across 2 short seasons, and it left behind a small, complete, oddly moving piece of children's television that still gives people something new to notice years later, whether that is a cipher hidden in a background prop or a moment of genuine grief tucked inside a joke about a puppet show. It is a small show by most measures, and it never asked to be anything larger than that. Somehow that smallness is exactly what has let it last. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.